In this video, I'll give you an overview of the Big Five personality traits as part of my personality framework series. I'll cover the basics of the system, its strengths and weaknesses, and give you a couple of resources to look up if you'd like to learn more. Without further ado, let's get into it. So the main idea behind the Big Five is trying to extract the core themes or factors of personality behind all the ways we use, and especially all the words and lexicon we use to describe people's personality. So the idea is that through a specific process of summarization and analysis, they reduced all the ways we tend to describe personalities through language to the least number of factors they could that were independent. And then one factor represented a whole facet of personality and was independent from the other factors. And through this endeavor, five main factors were found, and that's why they're called the Big Five. So in order to kind of present the whole system, I'll be referencing the revised NEO personality inventory, which is also known as the NEO PIR. It's one of the tests that's used for it. It's got a pretty good reliability and validity for its test, especially when you compare it to most other personality tests, which aren't that good in those regards. Although it's not the only test that exists, but it'll help give a bit more nuance by mentioning some of its inventories. But with that said, let's move on to the five traits themselves. I don't know if there's a specific order, but I just use mine. So we'll start with extroversion, which is basically a trait, or all of these traits are polarities or dichotomies between two extremes, you could say. And so the extroversion trait is a dichotomy, or it ranges from very high extroversion to introversion, which is its opposite. And now extroversion and introversion are pretty popular and famous personality concepts. In the case of the Big Five, it mostly refers to social interactions rather than other concepts of energy. So some of the definitions of extroversion and introversion is centered around what energizes you, spending time with people or spending time by yourself. And also there are also some other definitions. For example, in some versions of socionics, it's more about quality versus quantity mindset, but never mind. So in this case, it's more social interaction. And to kind of give a bit more details, if we look at the NEO-PIR subtraits for extroversion, we find friendliness, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity level, excitement seeking, and cheerfulness. So it kind of gives you a general idea of what this trait is all about. But yeah, basically, activity, liking social interactions, kind of liking doing stuff. That's the general thing that this trait measures. Then we have neuroticism, which is contrasted to emotional calmness or stability. So basically, neuroticism is kind of a form of moodiness, or strongly feeling emotions and kind of experiencing peaks and valleys in one's mood and emotions. The NEO-PIR subtraits for this category for neuroticism are anxiety, anger, depression, self-consciousness, immoderation, and vulnerability. Moving on to the next trait, which is conscientiousness. So that is the orderliness, we could say, and being focused, and it's contrasted to, impulsiveness and messiness to an extent, or being scattered. It's composed, at least according to the NEO-PIR, by the subtraits of self-efficacy, orderliness, dutifulness, achievement, striving, self-discipline, and cautiousness. So basically about being organized and kind of, pretty well structured way of going about things. Then we have the first trait, which is agreeableness, and it's contrasted to, I guess, in some ways, assertiveness or being more self-focused, versus agreeableness, which is more basically being nice and with other people and kind of accommodating, whereas low agreeableness is more about kind of self-focus, assertiveness, and to the extremes, antisocialness. And so the subtraits of agreeableness are trust, morality, altruism, cooperation, modesty, and sympathy, at least according to the Neo-PIR. And lastly, we have the openness to experience trait, which is contrasted with a rigidity or conformity or value in traditions, and lack of intellectual drive, perhaps. So that's kind of the idea of openness to experience, like an intellectual drive, an aesthetic drive, and open-mindedness. And it's got the Neo-PIR subtraits of imagination, artistic interest, emotionality, which refers to emotional self-awareness, basically being in tune with your own emotions. Adventureness, intellect, which represents basically a proclivity for conceptual or abstract thinking rather than a more concrete one. And psychological liberalism, which is basically one's propension to challenge authority, conventions, and traditional values. So if we take those 5 traits, extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness to experience, we get, they get compressed into the acronym OCEAN sometimes, or CANUE. CANUE, I'm not sure how you pronounce it in English. And so these are the 5 big traits. And basically the way it works is that you take a test where you basically, you're asked questions on a Likert scale. So basically, you've got 5 dots from strongly agree to strongly disagree on any statement. And basically it rates you on all those different traits and subtraits. And then you get a score, and then you get positioned statistically compared to most people. So it's a statistical positioning measuring tool to an extent, in a similar way to the IQ, where the score you get or the number you get is kind of telling you where you stand compared to other people. And so all of these traits usually follow a normal curve, which means that if you kind of map it out on a chart, you'd get a little bit of a mountain where basically most people sit in the middle. So most people are kind of moderately extroverted, moderately neurotic / calm, decently conscientious but not too much, decently agreeable but not too much, and somewhat open to experience. And then you've got some outliers, and the more extreme you go, either strongly or weakly in any of these traits, the less people you get. The Big Five is the most popular scientific personality model that exists, at least at the moment. That doesn't mean that it doesn't face any criticism, but it's basically the most used one, and it's overall got a pretty good standing. So now I'd like to talk about the S or SLOAN, or SLOAN notation. So this is basically a way of representing a person's score, or what the result they get from a test, by basically kind of giving them or representing each of their leanings on each of these traits with a letter. So basically, SLOAN refers to, for the first trait, which is extroversion, whether you're social, so that means you have high extroversion, or versus if you're reserved, so if you have low extroversion. And then for neuroticism, it distinguishes between limbic, which is basically high neuroticism, versus calm, which is low neuroticism. Organized, which is high conscientiousness, versus unstructured, which is low conscientiousness. Accommodating, which is high agreeableness, versus egocentric, which is low agreeableness. And lastly, non-curious, which represents low openness to experience, and inquisitive, which represents high openness to experience. And so basically, if you use this system, you can give a little type or a little acronym that represents someone's type. So for example, in my case, I would be represented by RLOAI for reserved, limbic, organized, accommodating, and inquisitive. So that's kind of a way to quickly represent someone's personality or their score according to the Big Five structures. Now, it does have, on the downside, that it kind of collapses people from a general score, into a type, basically, right? You're either social or reserved, when, as I said, most people kind of fall in the middle. But the SLOAN notation has some symbols that help to give a bit more nuance. So basically, depending on if you use a uppercase or lowercase letter, it represents how strong that is. And for traits where you kind of fill in the mid, you get an average score, you can put an X. So technically, for example, in my case, I'm kind of pretty in the middle for conscientiousness, so I'm not super strongly organized over unstructured. Well, that's one way of representing those results. So now I'll move on to the strengths of the Big Five. So it's the most robust framework and test, and it's got the most reliable test in terms of psychometric standards. So reliable and validity. And that, for example, like it is well based on the current standards for test and science. It's got pretty decent validity, and then if you, for example, take the test again later on, you'll have mostly similar results. So it's fairly reliable. It's also good at describing where you fall in and comparing yourself with other people, right? Because that's the whole thing it does, is it measures you on those different traits, which are supposed to be the main or most important factors behind personality. And then it tells you where you rank compared to, the rest of the population. And so it can be useful to make comparisons. Another strength it has is that it makes pretty limited predictions because it's mostly centered on these traits, right? So if you know that someone has very high conscientiousness, you can make a few predictions about their behavior that will be pretty limited because they're very focused on that one trait of conscientiousness. But in exchange, you'll have pretty good predictability. Whereas some other personality frameworks, which especially those that use types, will have to make more sweeping claims on broader claims, which will be not as supported. So I guess in this way, that's a strength in that, although the scope is more limited, you can make more stronger predictions. And because it's so good at description and comparison, it's pretty useful for people that study personality correlations with different types of other things, right? Or any studies that want to see how personality affects something else or is related to some other thing that you're studying, because you have pretty good tests to measure someone's Big Five traits scores, it works well. If we contrast that with its weaknesses, although it's interesting to kind of see where you fall compared to most other people, and it can be interesting to compare yourself to either the general population or some other individuals, it's not extremely insightful or useful for self-understanding and self-development, except maybe in cases of extreme scores, because you don't really learn that much about yourself. You just kind of see if you're very different from other people, right? So if you've got a very strong score in some area, that might be an interesting tidbit of information, because it might mean you need to do things a bit differently from other people, or you can explain why you have a hard time fitting in, or some things don't make sense to you. To an extent, having subtraits mitigates this issue, because basically the more details you get, the more granularity you have with those tests and results, the more you can start learning things about yourself, or consider new ideas. Because if you just use the main traits by themselves, you don't learn a super amount of things. You probably already know whether you're very social or not, whether you're very organized or not, etc. But for some of these subtraits, sometimes it can be pretty interesting, or can discover some new interesting concepts. For example, in my case, I have a very high psychological liberalism score, and I was surprised when comparing my results with other people who had decent openness to experience, that I was kind of very far above most of these of their scores. So in this way, you can have some interesting tidbits or insights, but it's not the most dense in that regard compared to some other personality systems. Another potential downside is that in giving you kind of an average score, it can erase, or it doesn't necessarily point out some of the potential inner contradictions, tensions, and dynamics that can happen beneath one of those traits. So, for example, as I said, I've got a pretty average conscientiousness, but in truth, it's more like I have some strong conscientiousness and some strong, whatever the hell you want to call the opposite, unstructuredness or impulsivity, that are kind of in a struggle, and then they win out in different scenarios, which is not something that I'll really learn through seeing that I just kind of score mostly a little bit above average. And I've talked more about this idea in my video about one-dimensional skills being gross simplifications. But again, that can be mitigated a little bit in part with if you get your subtrait scores, because then it kind of splits each of these big traits into more refined components. So maybe you can see that you have a very high score in one subcomponent or subtrait versus a very high in another. But still, in that regard, it's not super interested, or it doesn't really give a lot of focus on these tensions and dynamics. And then another problem it has is equivocality. Basically, it's kind of how do you define each trait, or what do you kind of put into each of them, and that based on how you define the traits, you kind of get different systems, and you get different tests, and so they might not actually measure the exact same thing. And for example, there's another alternative to the Big Five, which is Hexaco, or HEXACO, which is basically the Big Five, except they've added a honesty and humility trait, which is basically stripped, if we can contrast it with a Neo-PIR, is basically some components that are usually bundled in agreeableness have been removed and moved as their own big trait or major trait. And if you are interested in this kind of line of criticism, Michael Pierce has done a video series where he kind of delves deeper into this issue, which is pretty interesting. And overall, at the end of the day, it's still basically a test that's made by giving you a questionnaire where you have to self-assess and rank or say how strongly you agree or disagree with a statement. And so, like most of these psychological tests, it's kind of it's crunching the objective data that has been obtained through subjective self-assessment. And so there are some limits that come to that, but that's the case for any test that in the realm of personality or psychology, or at least that's based on yourself doing some introspection or self-assessment. But it's still a potential weakness. And then lastly, there's a couple of aspects which are not necessarily strengths or weaknesses, kind of depends on your personal perspective. Basically, one of the strengths, and well, it's kind of a trade-off, right? Of the Big Five is that it doesn't really try to explain anything, it's only measuring things. And that's why it's good, and that's why it works well for scientific studies, for making comparisons, for making correlations, because it's only focused on measuring things and not really explaining or making super complicated predictions. It doesn't risk failing as much or being kind of arbitrary or making mistakes. But on the other hand, right, you don't get that much additional information aside from those measurements. And then another trade-off to an extent is that, which some people appreciate, is that some of those traits aren't, well, like basically your score is not neutral. In some of the typology systems where you have different types, usually the idea is that all types are neutral, or like there is not like a good or bad type. But although you can have like a healthy or an unhealthy expression of a different type, basically all types are legitimate, or they're fine. With those, in contrast to that, with those type-based or trait-based systems, there might be some traits which are better than others. And actually, in society, the Big Five traits are not where you score for each trait is not well, some, or one side of the of the dichotomy is usually favored, basically, on a social level, right? So extroversion is usually seen in a more positive light than introversion. At least it also depends on different cultures, but usually that's the case. Neuroticism is seen as, the bad side. Like, you don't want to score high, you want to score low in neuroticism. Similarly, conscientiousness is, supposedly better than the alternative. Openness to experience is also, the good side. You'd rather it's better seen to have a high score in that than the lower score. And lastly, it's considered better to be, decent agreeableness, not maybe too high, because then that can be associated with a lack of assertiveness. But yeah, so there's kind of some moral judgment, especially more so with the hexaco, where you have honesty and humility, where you probably want to score high, or that's the good score, so to speak. So some people think that it's good because it's being honest, right? Like, basically some personality traits are bad, and you should kind of acknowledge that or measure that. But then it's a bit more loaded, so some people might not like that. Although, again, it's mostly descriptive. It's not really making, the prejudice you put into it is your own, based on the results of people. It's not necessarily promoted by the system, but there's a bit more of that in that system than a lot of alternatives. So in conclusion, I think it's a pretty good system, which does a decent job at what it's trying to do. But what it's trying to do is fairly limited, and it's not necessarily the most interesting if what you're looking for is some deep, insightful system that will help you generate more self-understanding and help you on your personal development journey. Although, to an extent, it can give you some pointers, right? So by rating you on some traits where it'd probably be better to kind of shift or move towards another end, or or to get better at a trait, for example, or towards, for example, trying to be less shy, so move higher towards extroversion. But yeah, anyway, that's my general feelings about it. If you'd like to learn more, I put links for all the things I've mentioned in the description. And if you'd like to test yourself to see how you score, there's a fun online test, which is based, at least uses the same trait and subtraits as a NeoPIR that you can find online at big5-test.com. You'll find the link in the description too. One of the nice things with that site is that you can then compare yourself to other people by using the links. And it's also open source and translated in many languages. So all in all, it's a pretty good online test. Probably one of the best and most reliable you'll find out there. So don't hesitate to give it a try. If you found this video interesting, you might want to watch the previous one I did, which was about whether you should trust personality frameworks or not. And I'll be posting a couple other overviews of other personality frameworks later on. So you might want to stay posted for that if you're interested. That's about it for today. Thanks for listening.